All right, we are back with part 2 with clutch setup. Today we're talking about lockup clutch. This is a direct drive clutch. Mod Quad or any version of this setup is going to be the same thing. So earlier we talked about spring pressure, we talked about stack height, we talked about install height, the steels that you're using, what you want to accomplish. One thing else also in there is oil itself. Depending on what weight oil you use or what brand oil you use is going to affect what your clutch does. So some oils are a bit more sticky, like Motul. That will have a lot more drag in it. Sometimes doesn't slide the clutch as well. Not that that's a bad oil or anything, but sometimes that oil also from having so much shear makes a lot of heat in that oil. So that can affect what's going on with it. So what we have is we have base spring pressure. Say we're at, we're looking at the 660 springs, and those were 28 PSI times 6. So say we're at 170 PSI spring pressure as a starting point, coming off of the what was it, 220 on the OEM spring. Say that's a good starting point of what we're going to. Now, what is the spring pressure going to do? Spring pressure is reducing the spring pressure is going to put less pressure on the fibers and steels and potentially allow them to spin a bit more than more pressure. So with more spin, you give up, you put some power through, loss through the clutch versus putting it to the tire initially. So spring pressure is all about initial dump of the clutch when you have a lockout or lockup. So spring pressure, the initial dump of the clutch, like how much hit do you want that to have? Because the lockup is only working when the output shaft or the front sprocket is spinning. So at that point, if the clutch is locked up 1-to-1 and the clutch is no longer spinning, then the lockout is functioning at whatever the reduction gear RPM is from the engine to the clutch basket, like a 3.2-to-1 or whatever that ratio is. So let's say you're at 5,000 RPM, your clutch is spinning at 1,500 RPM, that lockout's spinning at 1,500 RPM. But when you're in gear and you go to drop the clutch, this is not spinning at all. This is sitting stagnant. So there is no force applied on this lockout doing anything. It's all about spring pressure. So spring pressure is one of the most important things. If you don't have enough spring pressure when you dump the clutch, you will just burn right through the clutch, regardless of how much weight or anything that's going on here. So you have to have enough spring pressure to get the bike moving. And in turn, once the bike is moving or the tire is moving, then the lockup mechanism can apply more pressure. So spring pressure is always the first focus. Now, they send these out with bolts on them, and that's considered what weight is on there. As you reduce spring pressure, you're reducing the overall holding force of the clutch. From what we've seen, stock springs, a stock lockup, an 8-disc standard clutch setup will hold about 130 horsepower or so without any concern. Now, will it slip through the clutch a little on big horsepower at low RPM? Yes, but as far as being able to dyno it, being able to push it on the hill or on the track without any concerns, then that hasn't been a problem. So it kind of gives you an idea of like how much power it can hold just in a simple setup without doing anything crazy. So normally we get to the point where we're looking at how do we reduce the hit on the bike. Street tire versus sand tire versus dirt 300 foot, 8th mile, all of those are going to have different goals, and that's why you have to learn where you're starting from, make adjustments, see what happened, and go from there. Trial and error. So, going back to the lockup, once you get a spring kit that doesn't do anything weird, meaning like you drop the clutch and the bike goes but doesn't do anything drastic, doesn't burn through the clutch or doesn't blow the tire, then that's the goal. The goal is to give up a little movement on the clutch and a little movement on the tire at the same time to optimize the capability of the track conditions and the tire. That is your ultimate goal. Now, you can just burn the clutch and it'll never come back, and all your power goes into clutch heat. You can burn the tire and lose the race right on the start by blowing the tire. So the compromise is somewhere in between. On a manual clutch vehicle, as that engine's rotating and you go from that engine rotating at, whatever, 6,000-7,000 RPM when you're launching the bike, that RPM in a split second has to transfer through the clutch and to the tire, and you heard the phrase, something has to give. Well, if something doesn't give, if the tire hooks 100% and the clutch hooks 100%, well, something breaks. Either a sprocket, a chain, a transmission. So something always has to give in the aspect of one thing or another, or, the bike goes up and over backwards. So all of those things, you want to give up a little bit of power through the clutch initially to aid the tire in having traction. So that all goes with spring pressure. From spring pressure on to spring pressure directly affects your overall holding force, kind of repeating some things. But what goes on is, now that you've reduced holding force of, say, you took 50 pounds of spring pressure off, now your lockup, if you wanted to get to the same holding capability, say we were back to that 130 horsepower number, which is extreme for some, but let's say that number was 100 horsepower, 90 horsepower, 80. If you take out too much spring pressure, you have to take that holding force and put it over here on the lockup mechanism itself. And how do we do that? Well, we increase the weight of these arms. So if you get out of the hole, you get moving on enough spring pressure. Well, what happens if you don't increase the weight on the clutch arms is you end up burning through the clutch. So if you run in a situation where you might be good out of the hole, and then you get in 4th or 5th gear and it feels like the motor is not pulling hard anymore, or you stop hearing a RPM drop on the shift, that'll indicate that it is blowing through the clutch at a higher speed. So normally, if we see that, we need to increase weight on the lockout. So on the launch, initial is spring pressure. As we're moving on your 2-3 shift, you might be a little bit spring pressure, a little bit lockup. As you're putting more load on the engine, we come into lockup weight. So what do we do there? Well, we get a little bit longer bolt, and we add brass weight. Now HOD makes this kit. You can get it through us or give them a call. It's roughly $100. I forget exactly if they're 90 or 120 right now. Regardless of that, we have this available, or contact them directly. And they have kits in the weights of, a few different options there. Now, a wise man once told me, if you're going to make a clutch change that you actually need to make a change. A guy by the name of John Whitehurst, which is no longer with us, said go 10-gram increments at a time. So don't try to put, oh, I'm going to put, you know, one little washer on each of these bolts. Well, that's not going to do enough to make a change to see anything. If you're very fine tuning something, you can try it, but about a 10-gram change. So you can add 3-4 grams and make a, 12-gram change. Then you can do that. Anything else smaller is really kind of too small to see or a waste of time. If you're having something drastic go on, which is very noticeable, I would shoot for probably making a 15-gram change of adding additional weight. Something you do need to be concerned with is where you put the weight, the length of the bolt, how far that's sticking out. Normally I'll put the weight on the head side. So I'll put that on that side so we're not sticking out too far over there, so nothing hits. So spring pressure and lockup weight is a teeter-totter, always back and forth of what you need. Ultimate top end holding force is going to be on the lockup. So what you can do is start heavy on a lockup, run the bike, make passes, and start taking off a weight until you see a benefit, or until you hear the bike not drop RPM on the shift. So that's your indicator, not dropping RPM on the shift. They call it snowmobiling, where it just like not a harsh drop in RPM and kind of a monotone run. A lot of the Banshees push really aggressive on the clutch and they'll have a real monotone run. It all depends on what you're looking for, how aggressive you want to be there. So the main focus of most of these things is getting them off the line smoothly. More races have been lost in the first 5 feet than have ever been won in the last 100 feet. So getting off the line is the most important. You'll lose right there on the reaction time. You'll lose right there on clutch setup and the bike moving off the line. So guys always push, oh, I want more power, I want more power. And more power is a waste of time if you cannot get it on the ground. That's not going to solve your problem. It's going to make your problem bigger. So I always push back on guys and say, you don't need more power, you need setup. So more is lost on setup than ever is gained back on power. So you can easily have a bike with way less power go and smash on people with the right setup, efficient power to the ground, than somebody who comes out with, a big motor or a nitrous kit or whatever it is, and they blow the tires off and they go nowhere and they get smoked and look like a fool because somebody with a stock board goes and beats them because they know how to set up a bike. So setup is always most important. It is tough to understand that at a certain level. It is also much easier to be fast with something slow than being slow with something fast is easier to accomplish. So that is kind of a odd deal, but that's life of racing. So this is what I have for you. This is your homework of what you are going to be looking at and trying. So worst case scenario, you put a clutch together, you go too light on the springs, you go too light on the weight, and you fry the clutch. Costs you $150. An oil change, go in there, do an oil change and say, okay, well that didn't work. So if the rider is smart and good as a rider, they dump the clutch, the bike doesn't go anywhere, and they let off the throttle. All the tuning needs to be done well before you're ever in a race situation. And that depends on if you're at a track or not. You know, sometimes you got to tune out the track, but in a competitive race situation, like, that tuning should pretty well be done. Maybe you're changing small changes, but the learning really needs to be spent time before by yourself at whatever location that you're running and trying things. So bringing the tools with you out on location to do the changes. So something else that does need to be considered is, as you go light on clutch springs, if you are doing, if you're on the street doing a burnout, you need to be more cautious. You need to tell the rider that he needs to either be on or off the clutch. You can't, like, somewhat gradually slip into the clutch to break the tire loose. You kind of just got to dump the lever. So as you go lighter on clutch spring, or into a 7-disc or something like that, like, you don't get the opportunity of, especially on the street, you don't get the opportunity of, okay, sliding the clutch, I'm going to do a little launch, I'm going to come back, I'm going to do another little launch, and then I'm going to set up and go race. Like, you're going to get too much clutch heat. So there is ways to combat clutch heat or cool it down. The most effective thing to do is basically tilt the bike on its right hand side, let all the oil soak into the clutch, and hold the clutch lever open. That allows all the oil to get into the steels and fibers and take that heat out of the clutch and put it into the oil, and it can distribute to the rest of the engine. So that is caution to be taken there on what you're doing, advising the rider that more clutch heat is going to be more prominent. And it's a bit difficult, but you probably should get a thermal gun and keep an eye on clutch cover temperature. Will give you an idea. Normally, if your clutch lever is getting soft or clutch lever is going away, that's an indicator of you are pushing through the clutch. A little bit of give is normal. That's going to be a little bit of movement on the clutch, a little bit of heat there, but not the entire lever going away. That's go get another clutch. You smoke the clutch. You put way too much heat in it and glaze the steels. Now, as you're looking at the steels, these ones have not been ran, but they have a bit of a satin finish on it. If you pull them out and those are shiny or have tracking around them that is shiny, then you've had quite a bit of clutch slip, and the steels are glazed or polished. So you can go and sand these and put a satin finish back on them and run again. If they're too smooth, the clutch won't hold. So that is what I have for you. There is more information in there somewhere, but this is a basic of it. Trials and errors. Get some Raptor 660 clutch springs. Get a few tools to measure spring pressure. Cut some springs. Order some extra factory springs and cut those. Order a weight kit. And I always Loctite those bolts every time I do a weight change. I'll put red Loctite on these. And it is also beneficial to buy multiple of the lockout, so you can just grab a different lockout and change the whole thing instead of changing. These are fairly cheap, under $100. Instead of changing the bolts every time, you just grab the other lockout and put it on there and go. So that is what I have. I might have to take the second gauge off of there. I was trying that. I don't like how it's responding there. So These housings like that are fairly cheap, and they are a little bit tough to get at a lower PSI. That's why I added the second gauge. I had to get that from a rubber supply company that had that gauge. So, all right, that is it. I am done talking. I am ready to get some sleep. So, make some progress. Go fast. Bye.